CDK or Cloud Development Kit can be a little bit intimidating to learn. I know when I first started looking at it, I was completely overwhelmed by all the different concepts and all the different foreign ideas that I needed to wrap my head around in order to get started actually using it. And so what I wanted to do with this video is to help you learn CDK as quick as possible. I want to teach you all the fundamental concepts and the key ideas that you need to know about if you're going to be using CDK. Now, I don't want to get into every single detail about CDK, but I want to give you enough foundational knowledge so that you understand the key ideas and the key concepts so that you can start developing your application using CDK code right away. So that's the goal of this crash course, is to give you all of that important fundamental knowledge right away so that you can hit the ground running. So that is what this video is about. And so we're going to talk about some of the key ideas first. We're going to talk about what problem CDK solves, how it works, and some of its advantages. And then in the second half of the video, we're going to go into my code editor. I'm going to show you how to set up a project, how to create some infrastructure, how to deploy it into your AWS account. And I'm also going to give you some pro tips along the way. So that's the agenda for this video. So let's just get right into it. And so the first thing that I want to do is I want to kind of describe what CDK is by talking about the problem that it helps solve. And so on the left here, I have a screenshot of the AWS console. And if you're like me and probably 99% of people, when you first started learning AWS, signing into the AWS console and basically clicking buttons and doing things is probably the first thing that you did. So you probably created some resources and you basically went ham and just started clicking things. Hopefully you didn't get any AWS bills or surprise bills, which is a different story, but this is most likely how you learned AWS. And so this works fine when you're starting out. Maybe you started out with like a practice project or a practice lab, but as most people quickly realize, creating stuff manually in the AWS console doesn't really scale. It becomes difficult to manage, especially if you have really large projects that look like this, that have so many different moving pieces, so many different connections and configurations. And heaven forbid you fat finger something and accidentally delete something, like everything gets blown away and you need to start from scratch. It becomes very problematic to create these complex architectures manually in the AWS console. And so this is where CDK or cloud development comes in. It effectively lets you create very complicated or simple applications using just code itself. And so with this, you can choose from any different programming language that is available. So CDK currently supports JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, C#, Java, and Go, which is currently in preview mode. And because you're writing your infrastructure effectively in code, you also have access to all the helpful things that using code gives you. So you have access to an IDE that has autocomplete, that has automatic resolution of dependencies. You can also put your code into source control, into GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever you use. You can use it to submit pull requests to your peers so that they can double check what you're doing with your infrastructure instead of just going into the console and clicking, hoping nothing breaks. And further, you can use basic programming constructs like for loops or if blocks or all these other concepts that we have access to in standard programming languages. Now, CDK isn't alone in being the sole solution to develop your infrastructure using code. There's a whole bunch of other ones that are offered as well, some of them that are developed by external companies, such as Terraform or Pulumi. But CDK is kind of the homegrown solution that's developed and maintained by the AWS company. And so it's going to have native support, probably the quickest support for when new features get released, and it's going to have long-term support as well. So those are some key reasons why you may want to consider CDK over these other options. And so that's what CDK is. Now what I want to do is I want to walk you through kind of a very simple application that we could be trying to build and what it would look like if you had to do this in the AWS console itself. And then I want to show you in contrast what it would look like when we're using CDK code. And so this isn't a super complicated architecture here. We have a Lambda function that wants to talk to a DynamoDB table. It also wants to talk to an S3 bucket. In order to have all the right permissions, we need to have an IAM policy and all the permissions that are associated with the corresponding operations. Now, this isn't a lot of work to create all these resources, but there's kind of it's non-trivial, right? There's different things that we need need to create here. We need to specify all the settings. We need to wire them up together correctly. Need to ensure all the permissions are in order, all these kinds of things. So it's not a horrendous amount of work, but it is something that can easily go wrong. In fact, a lot of people do run into problems when they're creating stuff manually in the console. And so this, although seeming simple, can be a little bit more tricky than it looks in practice. And so what does something like this look like if we were to develop the same thing using CDK code as opposed to using the AWS console? Well, you're going to be surprised at how simple this is. It's like less than 20 lines here. And so if we look at these different sections one by one, the top section is creating our DynamoDB table. In the second line there, we're defining our partition key, just some different naming settings and the attribute types. Then we're defining our sort key. In the second section, we're defining our S3 bucket, which is just setting its version to true, which is an optional parameter. In the third section, we're defining our Lambda function. We're giving it a Node.js runtime. We're giving it a reference to a handler path, and then we're giving it a code link. And this is the cool part about using CDK as well, which is that you can, in addition to creating your infrastructure, you can also couple it with the code that's going to sit within things like your compute infrastructure and deploy that all at once as well, which is pretty handy. And the bottom section here regarding IAM is one of my favorite parts about using CDK, which is all of the utility and helper methods that make it really, really easy to manage permissions and to change attributes about your resources after you've initialized them. And so in this case, we're taking the table object and we're calling the grant read write data method on it, and we're passing it our Lambda function reference. And so what this is going to do in a single line of code is going to give our Lambda function access to our DynamoDB table. It's going to associate a role with it that has all of the read-write operations on that DynamoDB table. So put item, update item, get item, delete item, all the stuff that comes with it. And you can add some additional parameters here to give this a little bit more specificity if you want to control each and every policy action if you want. But really, really handy methods to do things like add permissions or take away permissions or add different settings as you go. And the bottom line here does the same effective thing for an S3 bucket. It's calling the grant read write method, passing in our Lambda function, and this is going to give it similar functionality or similar permissions such as put object and delete object and access to these kinds of APIs. And so this is what it looks like when you're using CDK. If you contrast this with doing it in the console, you can start to appreciate how much time you're going to save by doing this through, 10, 20 lines of code, whatever this is. And so this is really where the benefit comes in with CDK. Well, at least one benefit, that is. It's the speed of development that you can achieve by using it. Now, some of you astute observers may be wondering to yourself, what about AWS CloudFormation, which is another infrastructure as code solution that's developed by AWS? And so CloudFormation, the template files that you need to define look a little bit like this. And in the CloudFormation land, template files are kind of the code that you write in order to specify the parameters of your infrastructure. So in this particular case, you can see that we're defining on line 3 a DynamoDB table, and then basically every other line after that is all about settings that are going to apply to our table. If you recall in the previous slide, creating a DynamoDB table in CDK is like one line effectively. So you can see the contrast between using CloudFormation and CDK. Now, although CDK and CloudFormation are different, they are very much related in terms of how they work. And so in the CloudFormation and CDK world, a CDK construct, which is effectively just a resource that you create using CDK code, like this one, which is a DynamoDB table, in fact compiles into CloudFormation code. And so when you're writing your CDK code and you run a certain set of commands, you're going to actually create behind the scenes a CloudFormation representation of your code, and the CloudFormation template is what is going to be uploaded into the AWS cloud, and then the CloudFormation service is the thing that's going to go and provision all your resources. And so that's what's happening behind the scenes. You're writing CDK code, which is being compiled into CloudFormation, and that is what is being sent to AWS. So you don't need to know about CloudFormation necessarily in order to use CDK CDK, although it can be quite helpful, especially if you're using any of the kind of low-level objects, which we'll talk about later. And it's also helpful for debugging if you run into problems, but it's not a requirement, but it won't necessarily hurt if you know a little bit about CloudFormation when you're starting to use CDK. So I just wanted to call that out because this question, I get this a lot because CloudFormation is also quite popular when it comes to infrastructure as code. Okay, so let's move on now. I want to now talk about the development environment and just basically how CDK works from the user perspective. And so let's take the local development environment. You know, the development environment that you and I all go through when we're at work. We want to create a new feature or launch a new thing. We want to develop it and test it all out. So what happens is that first we write our CDK code in our local editor. We, before that, install some dependencies, do some basic setup and sanity stuff. But once we have that, we've written our code and we're happy with it, we're ready to get that into the AWS cloud. And when you're using CDK, it comes with a CLI tool, just called the CDK CLI. And so you run these commands, and one important one that you're going to be using quite a bit is called CDK deploy. This is the command that validates your CDK code to ensure that it is correct. There's no syntax errors, you're not missing any required parameters, things like that. And then if it's successful, so validated, it's going to generate that CloudFormation template file for you. You can in fact go into your project directory if you want to look at that CloudFormation file and see the thing that's going to be uploaded into AWS. You can also use a different command called CDK synth, which just does the compilation. It doesn't do the two-step process, which is the next thing I'm about to show you. So the second part of this process is it triggers a CloudFormation deployment after it generates the template file. So it's going to create a stack update request, and the template file that got generated is going to be sent up into the AWS cloud on your account. And then it's going to deploy all these resources for you via CloudFormation. And then in the CLI itself, it also gives you kind of an update line by line as these things get generated, as you would expect when you're in the AWS CloudFormation console, if you're familiar with it. And so this is how it works from the local development perspective. Now, this is great if you're just like a one-man show developing a pet project or a single developer. But how does this work if you're part of a larger team that's all contributing to source code that's going to work for a bigger project? And so that's what I want to talk about next, which is kind of like a automated deployment or a deployment workflow that uses CDK, that uses source control, which has multiple users working on it. And so with this, not a whole lot changes actually, which is the surprising bit. So you would still start with your code. You would just pull the most recent version from your remote repository there. And then once you make your changes and you're satisfied with it, you know, you do all your local development stuff. Maybe you add a table or remove some things, basically everything in the red box on the top, you would create a pull request. And once that gets validated and approved by your peers, after it gets pushed to the repository, it would trigger GitHub Actions. And there's a very neat way in AWS CDK to listen to GitHub Actions and also trigger a CloudFormation deployment. So effectively, what you can do is, if you're trying to work on like a prod environment like this one, where you want everything to be separate, this is in contrast to what we have at the top, which is like a dev environment. In the bottom flow, we can have a separate dedicated AWS account that's going to be associated with these GitHub Actions. And then whenever new changes occur, it's going to automatically pick them up. It's going to trigger a code pipeline for you. You can run like unit tests there if you want, or any additional testing to validate the code that's being proposed, and then automatically trigger the deployment of those resources into your account. So it's very, very handy, very helpful for productionizing CDK at scale for large teams or large projects. And so this is kind of how CDK works from a more practical perspective and how you interact with it as a user, either in a dev scenario or a prod scenario. And so what I want to do now is spend a little bit more time on the core concepts that you need to know about. And the one really, really important one, this is hands down the most important, is constructs. And constructs come in 3 different variations. There are level 1 constructs, level 2 constructs, and level 3 constructs. And a construct is basically, it's a building block in AWS. It can correspond to either a single resource, so an S3 bucket or a DynamoDB table, for example, or other constructs that are In particular, level 3 constructs can correspond to more than one AWS resource. And so that's a little bit of a hint in terms of what the difference between these constructs are. So let's walk through the difference between L1 and L3 constructs now so that you have a good understanding of what they are and when to use them. So the first one is L1 constructs, and these are often called CloudFormation or CFN resources. And every time you see the letter CFN something in your CDK code, that means that what you're using is an L1 construct. So CFN bucket, for example, if we're referring to an S3 bucket. And so level 1 constructs are the lowest level constructs that are offered in CDK, and they allow you to define every single setting that's associated with that S3 bucket. And usually you only really use L1 constructs when you need to control every single setting. And they're most useful for people that are already extremely familiar with CloudFormation. Now, I have to be honest with you here, I almost never use L1 constructs. They're extremely rare for me to use, but they can be useful in certain circumstances when you need to control like a very small setting that you don't get access to in some of the other constructs. So I say, in my personal opinion, avoid L1 constructs 99% of the time because you're going to be using the other ones a lot more often. So let's talk about the other ones now, which is L2 and L3, starting with L2. So L2 are sometimes referred to as curated constructs. And similar to L1, they apply to only a single AWS resource. So they can't be like more than one thing or like a Lambda function and a DynamoDB table. It's just a single resource. And these are kind of medium levels of abstraction. They're kind of right in the sweet spot, right in the slot in terms of abstraction. And the cool thing about L2 constructs in general is that they provide really sensible defaults, not like crazy defaults or forcing you to specify every single setting that exists for a particular resource. If you don't provide a setting for a particular resource, it's going to fill it in for you with something that's reasonable. And then if you don't like it, you can come back to it later and override it with something if you choose to. So say for something like a DynamoDB table, when you're using an L2 construct, you don't have to specify the read or write capacity consumption mode. If you leave it as default, I believe it does pay per request, but you can also override it if you want to do provisioned. This is just an example. And this works in very similar ways for other AWS resources as well. Now, another advantage of using L2s is that they also come with security best practices. So they're not too liberal in terms of the permissions that are applied to them, and they automatically come out of the box with what's best from the security posture perspective. Now, another thing that we talked about briefly in one of the previous slides was that they come with all these different very, very useful helper methods. We saw some in particular to granting permissions to your resources to access certain things, but there's a whole suite of other helper methods that you can use that allow you to change the properties of your resource much after you've actually initialized it in your code. So for example, like on the first line, you can say new DynamoDB table, and then later in your code, if you want to add a global secondary index, for example, but only in the case that something occurs, so maybe you have an if statement that determines this, you can easily add that global secondary index to it based on that if conditional. And so you get access to all these helper methods that allow you to change the state of your resources much after you've initialized them, which is very different than what you get in things like CloudFormation. Now, L2 constructs are going to be your bread and butter. These are the things that you're going to use 99.9% of the time. I would spend a lot of time getting comfortable and familiar with them because they're going to be what you refer to constantly when you're working with CDK. All right, so that's L2. Let's talk about L3 now, which is sometimes referred to as construct patterns. And they're called patterns because L3 constructs can contain more than one AWS resource, and they often come kind of as a package where they help solve a particular problem with a particular architectural solution. And so, for example, this is a ELB or an elastic load balancer that is pointing to 3 different EC2 instances, and behind the scenes has a auto scaling group and a bunch of other stuff that gets deployed as part of this pattern or construct as well. And so as you can imagine, these types of constructs are very high level and they're very abstract. But the advantage of using them is that there's some very kind of well-established, predetermined architectures that you may use again and again when you're working with AWS, such as like a Lambda and an SQS, or like an S3 bucket and a Lambda function, things like that. Or this one, which is a load balancer and a EC2 instances or set of EC2 instances. And so these types of constructs are very helpful in defining a very large set of pieces of infrastructure in just a couple lines of code. Now, keep in mind that if you use these components, you do sacrifice control because you're not going to control every single element. You do get speed because you get to create your infrastructure basically in a couple lines, but you're not going to be able to control every single thing. And so I would say use L3s when you already have a pre-established pattern that you want to use and you're willing to sacrifice configuration for speed. Now keep in mind that with these L3 constructs, it's totally possible to recreate the same architecture that's offered in an L3 construct, but using L2 or L1 constructs. And so these L3s, they're not magic. They're just kind of pre-canned building blocks that are already wired together in the right way. And so use them at your own risk. And like I kind of said, they're best for pre-made architectures, and they're very opinionated in terms of how they work. And so you may have noticed here as we talk through L1, L2, and L3, is that as we go from left to right here, we have increasing levels of abstraction. With L1, we have the kind of most basic concepts that refer almost directly to CloudFormation resources. Then we have L2, which is kind of the sweet spot with medium level abstraction with generous helper methods that help us get through some problems much quicker. And then with L3, you have a very high level of abstraction. So we don't control all the settings, but we get all the benefits out of these pre-canned architectures. And so this is kind of the mental model to use as you're trying to learn about how constructs work. Okay, also a little bit of extra helper details on using constructs. So AWS does offer some constructs out of the box, but there's also a construct hub, which is an open source website that contains definitions for all sorts of AWS constructs. And because CDK is just code after all that compiles into CloudFormation, you can download these constructs. They're all open source, all available for you, and you can use them. You can even contribute to these libraries if you want, if you come up with a pattern that's very useful. And so this is a quick way to learn about things that already may exist that are going to solve your problem and just get started a whole bunch quicker. You can just Google the Construct Hub to get access to this website. Now, another thing to know about is in terms of documentation support. And so there's a lot of really great reference documentation that's available from AWS using all the different programming languages. So this is the Typescript one, but it also gives pointers to all the different language websites too. And so you can see here, this is for an application load balancer, EC2 service. This is actually the pattern construct, the pattern L3 construct that we were just looking at. And so you can see there's what, like 10 or 15 lines of code here to define that pretty complex infrastructure. So pretty impressive. And this kind of speaks to some of the benefits that you can get out of using L3 constructs. Now, as a quick little tip about working with CDK in general, something that I found is that I constantly forget what the kind of resource names are for the particular things that I'm trying to do, like maybe a Lambda function or a DynamoDB table or something else. I found that using AI for this, so ChatGPT in particular, but any real AI solution or large language model will work, is awesome. It works really, really well. For whatever reason, I get like super accurate results almost the first try. And I'd suggest to give it a try because it can really kind of turbocharge your workflow so you're not fumbling around looking for the definition of certain resources. So that's just a little bit of a tip for you. What I want to do next is I want to just round things out by talking about some other key concepts that you need to know about. These two are important, but less intimidating and less complicated, but they are important. So we already talked about constructs, but now we're going to talk about stacks and apps. And these three things are very closely related, which is why they're all on the same page. And so let's talk about stacks first. So stacks are effectively just containers of pieces of infrastructure or containers of constructs that are all closely related to one another. And so when you initialize your project, it comes with a single stack. You can write everything there if you want, but you can also logically separate things into separate stacks and put your construct code that's specific to each stack in the corresponding one where it belongs. So stacks just give you a way to organize your resources in a more intuitive way so that you're not just jamming everything together and it's just becoming a massive like 500 line piece of TypeScript or JavaScript code. And so say for example, here we have a storage stack that's going to be for, our DynamoDB table or S3 bucket or RDS instances, stuff like that. Then maybe we also have a dashboard stack, and dashboards contain things like CloudWatch dashboards, things like alarms, logs, all that kind of stuff. And so obviously these two things are completely unrelated to one another. So you want to keep them logically separated in terms of their infrastructure components. And so as we kind of saw, you can use a variety of constructs. You can use L1s, L2s. And so our S3 bucket and our DynamoDB table, clearly they should reside in our storage stack. Whereas if we have other constructs, such as an L3 in this case, that contains our dashboard setup and anything else that goes into that, that should belong in our dashboard stack. And so that's the main idea of stacks. They just allow you to separate things from one another. And you can also, by the way, pass parameters into stacks and return things out of them if these two things are related. So say, for example, your dashboard needs to know about your S3 bucket or your DynamoDB name. You can pass those things in to your dashboard stack. So stuff that you define in each of the stacks can talk to one another in terms of references to the resource names. So that is certainly possible to do. So the last piece is the app, and the app is just the collection of the different stacks that are in your project. You can only have one app per project. You can't have more than one, but you can have as many stacks as you want within an app and as many constructs as you want within a stack. So that's the relationship between these three concepts. Okay, so these three concepts, constructs, stacks, apps, these are basically like the most important things that you need to know about. There's some more advanced things, but ultimately it boils down to these three things. And if you understand everything that I've said so far, or at least like 70% of it, you're probably going to be in a really good state. And so what I want to do now to get you to like maximum understanding and at the super confident level is that I want to do the hands-on demonstration with you. And so we're going to go into our IDE and do a bunch of things. First, we're going to initialize a local CDK project. I'm going to be using the Typescript programming language. Now, I'm going to be using Typescript, but I want to kind of emphasize that if you're using a different programming language or you're choosing to use a different one for your project, a lot of the concepts that I'm about to teach you using Typescript are going to apply equally regardless of which language you learn. So I highly encourage you to stick around even if you don't have any interest in Typescript, because a lot of what I've talked about is going to be helpful regardless of which language you use. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to just take a look at the project structure to understand like how it's set up, how the application's set up, how the stacks are composed, and how constructs are created. Next, we're going to create and deploy a variety of different constructs ranging from L1s to L3s, so you can see the difference between them. We're also going to go into the AWS console to take a look at the stacks in CloudFormation and also take a look at the resources that we create just to validate everything is working. And then I'm also going to give you other tips as we go that'll boost your productivity, such as how to use CDK Watch or how to use, there's a feature called CDK Migrate that lets you import your resources from your AWS account into a CDK project. So if you started using the AWS console and you want to start using CDK, we can do that too. And so that's what's coming for the hands-on section. And I'll see you over in my terminal where we'll get started with setting up our project. So I'll see you there. Welcome back, everyone. Now, before we can get started with the hands-on section here, I do have some housekeeping items to take care of first. These are just some prerequisites that you're going to want to ensure that you have installed before you can follow along here. And I do encourage you to follow along in this demonstration. I find that's the best way to learn. Just watching someone do this isn't very helpful, but actually typing it out yourself is really going to build those foundational skills. And so the first thing that we're going to need is Node.js. So here's a link that you can use to download Node.js. Then we're going to use the AWS CLI. Obviously, CDK has a dependency on the AWS CLI, so if you don't have it installed, then you're going to need to. Here is the link where you can download this. By the way, I'll put the link to this file down in the description and comment section, so you can just click this stuff instead of having to type it in. In addition to the CLI being installed, you're going to have to configure it with a user profile using the access key and the secret access key. And preferably, you're going to need to have the administrative permissions associated with it, just so that you don't run into any kind of annoying errors as we follow along here. And the next thing, obviously we're going to need CDK installed. CDK is the CLI. You can either use this command here to npm install it, or you can go to this website to follow the hands-on instructions. And then finally, since we're using TypeScript, you're also going to need to install TypeScript just using this npm command here. Okay, and let's just close this out now. And before we get started with the CDK part, you'll notice that I am using a different terminal today. Now, normally I am a big user of iterm2. I've been using iterm2 for many years now, but this terminal is called Warp, and they're actually the sponsor of today's video. Now, in addition to it being absolutely beautiful and modern looking, there's also a very helpful number of features that are built into Warp that just make your life a whole bunch easier. And I'm going to be talking about some of those features as we go through the video, and just some other things to take a look at before we get into it. If we do Command P to look at some of the features here, they have these concept of workflows, and workflows allow you to run a sequence of commands, also allow you to provide in input arguments as well. So very helpful if you're going to run like a sequence of things all at once. I'll show you an example of this in a moment. There's also an AI feature that helps you determine what the correct syntax is for a command that you're trying to look for. And you can use natural language to describe what you're looking for. So for example, if I close this and I just ask Warp AI, how do I install CDK here? It's going to give us the relevant command. So there's two ways to do this. If you're using Python, here's the right one, but this is the one that we would want. So npm install -g AWS CDK. So this is very helpful for just finding commands or figuring out like how to do things. So like how to find a file named foo.txt, and this will give you the corresponding commands like you can see here. So very handy AI features as well. So we'll be talking about these as we go. Now I'll be using Warp on my Mac, but they just announced support for the Linux operating system as well, and they're currently working on a Windows version 2. Now if you'd like to try it, you can go to warp.dev in order to download it, or use the link in the description or the comment section below in order to give it a try. Okay, so that's it for the housekeeping. Let's get started with the actual project here. So in order to do so, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to want to make a directory for our project, and you can see some of the autocomplete stuff popping up here. And so let's call this my CDK demo app. Let's just cd into this app now. Okay, and you can see that this thing is totally empty. And so the first command that we want to run here is the init app command. And this is going to download and install a bunch of CDK dependencies. It's also going to create the project structure for us. So let's do this now. So it's CDK, and there's some nice autocomplete for us here. If you just press right on your keyboard, you can autocomplete. So it's CDK init app -- language, and then I'm using TypeScript here. And so TypeScript is my language of choice for this demonstration, but of course there's also Java, Go, C# and a bunch of other languages that are supported as well. So I'm just going to press enter now, and it's going to run through a bunch of installations here. This can take a little bit depending on your internet connection, but after this I'm going to show you the project structure to explain a little bit about what's going on, what everything did here, so that you can see how the project is structured. Okay, so that was pretty quick. So let's go into Visual Studio Code now, where I already have this folder opened up here. So here's my CDK demo app, which is what we just created. And so there's a bunch of files and folders here. You don't really need to look at all of them, but I want to explain to you some of the important ones. And so you can take a look at the README, but the README isn't very helpful, to be honest. This is just some npm commands, but it's kind of not very useful for our use case. So package.json, no surprises here if you're a TypeScript user or a JavaScript user, just some commands, also a test command using the jest framework, and also a pointer to our entry point, which is my CDK demo app.js in this example. We also got the jest config, no point in looking there. We have a cdk.json, which is some specifications or some configuration for CDK. Also not really worth looking at too much. So first, let's just look at the test directory. I'm going to open this up. And the neat thing about using CDK with TypeScript and any programming language really is that you can write unit tests that verify that your infrastructure is being created as you intend to. And so as you're creating your infrastructure in your TypeScript code, you can also create unit tests to ensure that it's actually provisioning it in the right way. And so how this works, right now it's just automatically commented out, but we're creating an instance of our app here, which we'll get to later. We're creating an instance of our stack. And then what we're doing doing, or how these tests work, is that they take as input your stack definition. And then if you look at line 14 here, we're saying template.hasResourceProperties. It's looking for an AWS SQS that has the property visibility timeout and a value of 300. So essentially how these unit tests work is that when you run CDK synth, or when you run unit tests in this case, it'll create a CloudFormation template file. And then this unit test will look at your CloudFormation template file through the stack template, and then it'll check to see if a resource is there and if it has the right property. So very, very handy to verify the integrity of your infrastructure before you actually go and deploy it. And you can also catch things like when it hits the pipeline if you forget to build it before you actually submit a PR or push your code. Anyways, testing is very, very helpful. We're not going to talk about it too much in this demonstration, but the two folders that are important here are the bin and the lib folders. Now the bin contains your app, and remember there's only one app per project, and the lib needs to contain your stacks. And remember, you can have many stacks in your project. And so let's take a look at the bin file here. But before we do, you'll notice that it automatically has this name here, myCDK demo app.ts. And how did it get this name? Well, it's basically just taking what our project folder name was and then just using underscore case here to determine that. And so that's how it gets that name, but you can also override these, and then you can change the pointer in the CDK JSON if you want to change the file name, or just do a clean refactor in your IDE and it should work out of the box. Anyways, let's open this up and see what is inside. And so if we take a look at this, okay, the top couple lines here, just some dependencies, that's fine. On line 6, we are creating a new instance of our app. And remember that you can only have one app per project. If you try to create a second one, you're going to run into an error here. And on line 7 to 21 here, we are creating a new instance of a stack. Remember, we can have many stacks. Right now, we only have one stack, and it's contained within this other file here that we haven't looked at. And we pass in the app construct, and then we also give it a logical name. And we also can provide it with input parameters as well. And so if in this stack, it requires some input from maybe another stack that you've created, or maybe you have like some config, variable out here. So like const config is equal to something. You can pass these values into your stack and then read off of them in here. So in here, you can read off them and pass in those parameters into your stack itself. So that's very useful if you want to pass things around and use them within the stack code. Anyways, if we take a look at this a little bit more, it's passing in some properties. env is one that you can specify the account that you want to deploy this to. But right now we're just working with a single account. Now, if you wanted to have multiple stacks, we talked about having multiple stacks in the demo section or in the slide section of the video, you would just say new other stack or whatever you call it. And then you would just kind of use the same format here, or I guess we can call this other stack. And then there you go. And you just need to create a class called other stack. You'd basically just copy and paste this one here and then change the name. And then you would put it in whatever constructs that you want inside of it. So it's very, very easy to create more than one stack, just a couple lines of code, and it really helps you maintain a good project structure. Okay, so for this video, we're just going to be working with one stack though, not to complicate things, but let's go into the meaty part of this now, which is the actual stack itself. And so I'm going to open under the lib directory, the myCDK demo app-stack.ts. And this is really where all the magic happens. This is where you define all your constructs, and your constructs, as a reminder, are just your AWS resources. And so if we take a look at what's happening here, we're exporting a class. Ooh, I hate this like hover over thing. Okay, I'm going to use my keyboard. And we're exporting a class. It's extending the CDK stack construct. As you can see, we have a constructor. It takes in the scope, which if you remember, we were looking at this over here. The scope is the app. That's the first argument that's coming in. And just for context, the constructs that you create are always, they have a parent-child relationship. So when you create a construct, it always needs to pass in itself into the child construct so that it has a reference to its parent. And so this will become more clear as we go along. Then there's also the ID, which is just a string and its names. And then the props are any properties that you want to pass in to your construct so that you can use it like that config value we were just talking about. We're just making a call to super here, and the rest is where all of our code will go. So you can see it's making a queue here, but we're going to get to this in a minute here. Okay, so this is just the project structure here and how the files work. Let's go back to our terminal now before we actually create any of these constructs, because I want to explain to you some of the key commands that you're going to be using as you work through CDK. And then we'll come back here in a couple minutes and then we'll create some constructs and run some of those commands. So let's go back to warp here really quick, and let's just do Command K to clear all this out. So if you just do CDK help, you should be able to see a bunch of commands that are at your disposal. These are all flags, by the way, the ones that have the double dash in front of them. But the main commands you have are up here. So we have CDK list, and you can see it lists all the apps in the stack. It's helpful if you have many stacks and you want to just see the ones that it recognizes. We also have CDK synthesize, or synth for short, and this generates the CloudFormation template for you. So if you want to see the CloudFormation template, you can just generate it on the fly and go and inspect it and take a look. Then there's also the CDK bootstrap command. The CDK bootstrap is something necessary that you need to do if it's your first time using CDK in an AWS account and in a particular region. By default, when you configure your CLI, you need to say which region it's going to belong to. I'm in US East 1. I've already bootstrapped, but I'm going to show you this command and show you what it does in a couple minutes here. Then we also have the CDK deploy command. This is the command that actually deploys out into AWS. So it'll deploy into CloudFormation. CloudFormation will get a change set that you've generated in your local terminal here, and then it'll start doing all the things and deploying all the resources into the cloud. There's some other ones that are worth mentioning, such as CDK watch. We're going to get to this one later. And this one allows you to basically monitor your file system and make changes as you type in changes and save things into your IDE. Then we have CDK destroy, which is a cleanup. The rest of this stuff here isn't really that helpful, at least for right now, but you can kind of take a look at this and see what's going on if you want. Anyways, let's clear this out and run a couple of these commands. The first one is CDK list. This one is just going to give us a list of the stacks that we have in our project. So my CDK demo app, no surprise there. So nothing really interesting to see. Let's do CDK synth. This one will be interesting because it'll be pretty much empty because we haven't provided it any infrastructure to create as part of our project yet. But you'll notice that it's not empty, which is a little bit interesting because there are just some boilerplate stuff that comes as part of your CDK project. So this is pretty much meaningless to the normal observer, but it's got some metadata that's important for CDK to function properly. Okay, and then we have the CDK bootstrap command. And now I just wanted to point out something that was a little bit interesting about warp here. You remember at the start of this video, we ran through a bunch of commands. We were making directories, changing directories. If we use one of the workflows here, which is one that I've actually created, and it's called CDK initialization. What this workflow does is that it creates a directory for us. It changes our directory into it. It initializes our project with the language of choice. You can even add this as a parameter if you want, so that you can make this dynamic. So you can just type this in the same way that directory name is dynamic, like you can see there. And then it runs CDK bootstrap for you. So I'm not going to run this now, but this is a nice little thing that Warp does using these pre-canned workflows that you can use to make your life a little bit quicker. It's much better than using aliases, which is what I normally would have done or have done in the past. Anyways, let's close this out and Command C to get rid of all this and just go back to our normal terminal. Okay, so what were we doing? We were going to run CDK bootstrap here, and what this will do is it's basically going to create a CloudFormation stack. Now, I've already bootstrapped this account, which is why this happened so quickly. So it's going to create a CloudFormation stack in your AWS account, and it's going to be called like CDK Toolkit or something like that. Let's actually pull it up so you can see what I'm talking about. So here is my AWS account, and if we go into the CloudFormation section here, now I have a bunch of stacks. A lot of these are unrelated to this project, but if you look at the CDK Toolkit one, this is what it would have generated if you have never run CDK Bootstrap before. So what it created the CDK Toolkit stack, and if you go to events, you can see kind of what it was doing. It's kind of creating a role. If you go to resources, you can see exactly what it created. So an SSM parameter, an IAM role, an ECR repository, some more roles, some policies, a bunch of other things. Nothing really that we care about here. You just kind of have to do this if you're using CDK or if you're starting to use CDK. Okay, so this was the bootstrap command and a bunch of the other commands that we just saw. We're not going to run deploy yet because there's no real point because we haven't created any infrastructure yet. So let's go and create our infrastructure now. And I want to start by keeping things really, really simple. And what we're going to do do is we're going to start by creating a L1 and L2 construct of an S3 bucket, because we talked a lot about how L1 constructs are kind of rarely used and how much better L2 constructs are. But I want to prove it to you, and I want to show you how much better L2 constructs are and some of the features that you have available if you're using L2 versus L1. So let's do this. So we're going to create the L1 construct, and we're going to call this const, getting ahead of myself here. Const level 1 S3 bucket is equal to new CFN bucket. And you can see it's doing some nice autocomplete here. And then we need to pass in a couple things. The first thing that we need to pass in is this, which is just the current construct that we are in, which is my CDK demo stack. We need to give it a name. So my first level 1 construct bucket. And then we also need to give it some properties. So properties, which is just going to be a JSON object here. And so right now I can deploy this as is, and this will work. So we can actually try this out if we want right now. But what I want to do is I want to walk through how to do this with the L2 bucket as well, and then show you how you specify a very particular setting to control the configuration of your bucket. So what I want to do is I want to create a versioning configuration on this bucket. And versioning is essentially, in the world of S3, if you kind of overwrite a file, it'll keep the old one for you. And I want to enable this for this bucket because this is a good thing to have for many different applications. So how do we do this for our level 1 construct? Well, we just say versioning configuration, and then it's another JSON object that goes inside here. And then we have to say like status, and then we have to actually type in the thing. So it's enabled here. And if you put a lowercase e, this will actually not work, which is something I learned the hard way. So as you can tell, it's a little bit kind of verbose and not very intuitive. There's no enum for this. You're basically just writing it as a string field. So how does this contrast with level 2 buckets or level 2 constructs? Let's take a look at that now. So we're going to do const level 2 S3 bucket. And this time we're going to say, okay, new buckets and bucket. There you go. And same kind of story. And we're going to call this my first level 2 construct bucket. And we're going to do an open closey there. And then instead of having to do this nonsense like we did up here with versioning configuration and status enabled, it's much cleaner. All you have to do is say versioned true. Boom, done. So you can see a little bit about how this is easier. And so this is going to become more clear in terms of how level 2s are better, but this is kind of the first version of this. And so at this point, I think we're ready to actually deploy this out now and to see how it behaves in AWS. So let's go back to Warp really quick, and we're in the project directory. Let's do CDK synth first. And I'm going to show you the difference between the CloudFormation template file that gets generated for the L2 and the L1 construct. So if we take a look at this, so we scroll up. Oh, another nice thing about Warp, by the way, you can pin the commands to the top that you just ran. Oh, and by the way, another nice thing about it before we get in, if you click on the block and then you right click, you can copy the command, or you can do something that's pretty interesting, which is to share this output that you just had here. And you can give this a title, so my output, and then you can create a link, which you can now go grab. And then if I go back to like my browser here and you paste this in, like here's the output that I just had. So this is a very useful feature in Warp to show maybe your colleague if you run into an error that you want to try and debug and figure out, or you pull them to your computer, hey, look at this, what's wrong? You can just share them a link here, and you can put this behind permission control as well. Anyways, that's a nice little feature of Warp that I just wanted to talk about briefly. Anyways, going back to the command here, you can see all the way at the top under the resources section, we have my first level 1 construct bucket. And it ends pretty much right here. So we have a type S3 bucket. We do have version configuration as enabled. We have some metadata stuff, which we can ignore. And then we have our level 2 construct bucket. And also we have versioning configuration, same values, right? Versioning configuration, status enabled. And we also have 2 important fields here: update, replace policy, and deletion policy. I wasn't going to talk about this right now because I wanted to show you what happens when we deploy, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. So one thing to keep in mind when you're using CDK is that certain resources that you create, you may want to like do things like rename them or change some key properties. So with our S3 bucket, for example, what would happen if we tried to rename our S3 bucket in our CDK code? Now, the default behavior, if you're not using an L2 and if you're using an L1, is to delete your S3 bucket and recreate a new one. Now, in a production application, maybe you have like a bunch of data that's in your S3 bucket. So this may be a little bit of a problem, right? You're going to delete your bucket and all the data and create a new one that's now empty. This is not good. And so that's what this update replace policy does for you. If you set this to retain, then it's going to keep your original bucket and then create a new bucket for you. And then you can copy the files over if you want. So L2 constructs have this automatically enabled to retain for you, but you can override this to set it to delete if you really want to. The second thing is the deletion policy, and this applies to stack deletion. So at the end of this project, we're going to do CDK destroy, which is going to tear down our project. Now, by having retain here in our code or in our CloudFormation file, it's going to keep this resource even after we delete our stack. Another very helpful thing to ensure that you don't blow yourself up and delete all your resources as part of your project that you don't intend to. Anyways, this is a little bit of the template file that gets generated. So let's clear this out. And so now we're going to do CDK not CDK destroy. Not yet. That's later. We're going to do CDK deploy, excuse me. And so CDK deploy is going to actually deploy this into our AWS account and into CloudFormation. And so it's synthesizing. Okay, we had no syntax errors, which is good. It's doing the deployment now. It's creating a CloudFormation change set. And if we go into our AWS account and look at CloudFormation, which I will do, well, before that, you can actually see it gives you a preview here, which is pretty much it shows you the exact same thing in CloudFormation. But let's just go show you that really quick to prove to you that this is right. So if we refresh these stacks now, you can see a new one, my CDK demo app stack. And then inside this, if we go to events, you can see what it's doing. So it's creating some resources, it's creating CDK metadata, yada, yada, yada. You can refresh this and see it progress over time, but it may take a couple minutes because it's the first time. So one thing that you may notice is that when you do the CDK init app, nothing is deployed into your AWS account yet. Like everything is local. It's only when you run CDK deploy do your resources actually get into your account. And so that's just one distinction. You can initialize as many apps as you want, but nothing is going to actually get created until you run CDK deploy. So as you can see here, this is now successful. We have create complete here over on the left-hand side. So let's go take a look at what we actually created over in S3 now, right? Because we should have two buckets. So I'm just going to duplicate here. We're going to go over into S3 and let's take a look at what we got. And if we just sort by creation time, because I have a lot of buckets, you can see here we have two new buckets. So my CDK demo app stack. So it's prepended with the name of our stack. We have our level 2 construct bucket. Then we have our level 1 construct bucket. And one thing that you'll immediately notice is like, what is the deal with these names here? I did not say I wanted this to be named this thing. And this is intentional by CDK. If you don't specify the name, it's not going to know what to name it. So it's just going to give you this random garbage here that uses your logical ID that's kind of built in here. Now, if we want to override this, we can certainly do this. And so you can see here. So here was the logical ID. And it had this as part of its name. But if we want to change the actual ID here, let's actually do it for the level 2 bucket. You actually need to fill out a very specific property, which is called bucket name here. And you can see since it has the question mark, it's an optional field, so you don't have to actually fill this in. Remember that your buckets names in the world of AWS need to be unique. So we need to come up with a unique name here. So let's do my first level 2 construct bucket for real. And hopefully no one has the same name here as us. And one thing to keep in mind here before we deploy this is that because we have that update replace policy set to retain, when we redeploy here, we're going to keep that old bucket. It's not going to get deleted. And so that's just another thing to keep in mind. And if you want to destroy the old one, what you would do is you can override that by saying removal policy. And you would say cdk.removal policy, I believe it is. Yeah. And then it's .destroy. So that's how you would get rid of the old one here. But we don't want to do that. I just want to kind of show you how this works really quick. So let's go and deploy this. We're going to go back to Warp. We're going to clear everything out here and just do Alt commands. This is a nice little thing, by the way, about using Warp as well. If you just press up on your keyboard, you can see all the commands that you ran in a nice intuitive way, all of them at once instead of just, the single one when you normally use like iterm or whatever. And also on the right, it shows you kind of some details about the command, when you last used it, how long it took to run, all this kind of nice stuff. So let's run CDK deploy again, and we ran into an error here, unfortunately. What happened? Invalid S3 bucket name. Okay, only lowercase letters. I made this mistake last time, and I'm surprised I did it again. So let's just change this really quick. My level 2 construct buckets for real. Wow, that was kind of embarrassing, but it's okay. For real. Okay. Again, CDK deploy, hopefully no other errors here. Let's see what happens. Okay, we're synthesizing, we're going, we're publishing. Things are happening. The wheels are in motion, creating that change set. Let's go back into our AWS account and take a look at CloudFormation really quick again. And we should see pretty much the same stuff. So creating, okay, update in progress. Hopefully this doesn't take too long here, and let's just keep on refreshing. Okay, so it's, okay, this is interesting. Requested update requires the creation of a new physical resource, hence creating one. So this is the important part here about having that update policy to be retained. It's going to create a new one instead of overriding it. So it's creating it, yada, yada. If this takes too long, I'll just fast forward it. But after a moment or so, you can see the update is now complete. Let's go check out our S3 buckets again. I'm going to click on refresh, and we should see 3 S3 buckets. And we do. We see these 3 here. So my CDK demo app stack, we have the level 1 construct, we have the level 2 construct, and the new one with the readable name that we just specified. And because of that retain policy, we are keeping this old one. So if we want, we can just go and delete this manually if we'd like, or do something else with it, copy the files over or something. Whatever you want, it's up to you. Okay, so that's a little bit about the L1 versus L2 constructs. There's a couple other things as well that you'll notice if you try and use them in your IDE here. If we do like level 2 construct dot, there's a bunch of methods that you can do here. So like add event notification, add lifecycle rule, add metric, add notification, all these very helpful things that you can do on the L2 constructs. If you try to do this for the level 1 construct, there's like not really much useful stuff. So you don't have the ability to like add methods or add event notifications. It's very just kind of raw. All that stuff you'll have to specify yourself. So it's a little bit frustrating, but level 2 construct, this is why I said they're the bread and butter that you're going to be using the most. So I would get used to using them and understanding how they work. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out before we move to the next section, I wanted to give you a helpful tip here on understanding like which properties are available on these constructs. So in any editor, because we're using infrastructure as code here, you can just do command click. Well, this is the shortcut in Visual Studio Code on a Mac, but I'm sure it's something similar on Windows. You can command click into the source here, and you can see like a bunch of the methods that are available. You can read up on what they do. So occasionally I will pop in here if I'm trying to debug something or understand like, okay, there's an enum for bucket encryption. I can use that instead of typing in the entire thing. Very helpful to know. So some of this stuff is useful just to take a look at and just to understand what fields are available to you. Whereas if you look at like the CFN bucket, it's not nearly as helpful. There's more stuff here, but it's like all interfaces and not very readable as well. They do have some descriptions, but I highly prefer the L2 constructs. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to create a little bit more of a advanced setup, not too advanced, but what I basically want to do is that I want to create a architecture where every time someone uploads something to my S3 bucket, I want to push a message into an SQS queue. And so how do we go about doing this? So we need to create a new resource here, which is a SQS queue. So we're going to say const queue is equal to new queue, and you can just do the autocomplete here to automatically resolve the dependencies. We need to say this, and then you can call this whatever you want. So my queue, and then we're going to give it some properties, and let's just make a little space here. So there's a bunch of things you can pass in here. I'm just going to give it queue name, which is optional, and we're going to call this my queue as well. And so that's all you really need to do in order to create a queue. But how do we link this now to our L2 S3 bucket? How do we make it so that anytime someone uploads something, we just dump the dump the message into the queue. And so one way to do this is to go into the AWS documentation, figure this out, or kind of play with the methods that are available to you and see how this works. But like I said in the slide section of the video, it's very helpful to use AI for these kinds of things. And so this is where it's really helpful to use something like Warp, which has AI features that are built into it. And so what we can do is we can do control space here to launch the AI component. And so what we're going to do is we're going to type in our prompt over here at the bottom of this pane. And so we're going to say how to link a S3 put event to an SQS queue using CDK and Typescript. And let's see if this gives us the right answer here. I haven't tried this prompt yet, so I don't even know what it's going to give us. So hopefully this comes up with the answer I'm looking for. And it is right. I can actually see right off the bat. So you can read this whole thing if you want, but if you look at it, it's saying add S3 put event notifications to the SQS queue. And what you can do is you can say bucket.add event notification, and you can give it the event type that you want and then the notification destination queue. So I'm actually going to copy this whole blob here. I'm just going to paste this down here, and then we're going to kind of fill it out. And so let's go back to our editor now and use that command. So I'm just going to paste that in. So that's our level 2 S3 bucket. We're going to add a notification. Looks like it's not recognizing this correctly. Let's just change this up here. So we're in the S3 section. We're going to add event type. Normally, Visual Studio Code works pretty well here for autocomplete, but apparently not for this particular case. And we also need to add SQS destination here. So we have the new SQS destination. And so you can see here how powerful this is. With the L2 construct, we can just say, hey, we want a notification and we want it to be object created. And here's the destination, which is a queue. Just imagine having to do this manually in the AWS console. You'd have to navigate to like 10 different pages, create your queue, link them together, yada, yada. Very, very annoying and frustrating. And you can see like all the different commands that are available to the L2 S3 bucket. So add lifecycle rule metrics, all these different things that make this very, very easy. Also, all the permissions that you can add. So you can do grant, read, write, give it a pointer to a Lambda function or anything that's going to read off this S3 bucket, like an ECS cluster, something like that. So very, very handy. Anyways, this is looking good here. So let's actually just save this. We're going to go back to Warp. Let's close the AI portion here, and I'm going to do Command R to search for my old commands, and we're just going to say, what was it? Deploy, right? Or you can just press up and do deploy. Anyways, CDK deploy here is the command to run. Hopefully there's no syntax errors. So this is going now, and this is an interesting bit here, which is that anytime there's any permission related changes when you run CDK deploy, it's going to give you a preview here. So it's making some changes to assume role. It's giving it to the Lambda service. It's giving some permissions for SQS to get queue attributes, the URL and the send message. It's giving it to the S3 service, and then it's doing some stuff with the put bucket notification. And the principle is there's some kind of handler here. But anyways, anytime there's an IAM change, you do need to like look at this stuff and confirm it. So we're going to click Y now, or type Y and press enter, and this thing is going to go. And we're going to check it out in the AWS console in a second to make sure that it worked correctly. Okay, so this just finished. Let's check out our browser now and look at this in the AWS console. So let's go to the SQS section and just verify that we actually have a queue there and it's wired up correctly. So you can now see we have a queue called my queue, which is the one that we just created right now. We have a message available, which is cool. So when you initially create this, I believe it sends you like a test message. So if we go to send and receive messages and we just go to pull for messages here, we should be able to see the payload. Yeah, here's the message. And you can see it's a S3 test event. So everything is coming from our my first level 2 construct bucket for real. Whenever an event or whenever an object gets created there, it's going to upload to this SQS queue so that we can process it a little bit later. So this is kind of an intro to CDK. I want to talk about some other features now that I think are important to know about. And so as you may noticed here, the workflow was a little bit painful when we were kind of going through this. We were, typing in some changes into our code, and then we were having to go back to our console and, like type CDK deploy, wait for it to change, yada, yada, yada. Kind of annoying, right? So one solution to this is to use the feature called CDK Watch. And CDK Watch is basically a feature where it looks at your file system and detects saves or detects changes to your files, and then automatically computes the CloudFormation template and deploys that into your AWS account. Very, very handy to make your development a little bit quicker. So you can do CDK Watch here, and this will just kind of bootstrap itself. So now it's waiting. It's just doing an initial deployment here. Okay, so now we're ready to go. And so what we can do is we can like change something. So let's try like object created. Instead, we're going to do object created copy. I don't know what that does, but let's try this. I'm going to press Control S now, and boom. So it detected the change. And so it's starting to deploy it right away. So this is a nice little thing that you can do to speed up your development time, so you're not sitting around waiting too much. And then if you want to just cancel this, you can do Control C and get rid of this. So that's one nice little feature to know about. The other one to know about is if you're in a situation where you want to go from resources that have been created manually in your AWS console and you want to get started using CDK. I want to show you a really quick way to do this. I actually have another video all about this, but let me show you kind of how this works. And so I'm just going to go back here. I'm going to create a second directory here. We're going to call this my other directory, and let's just cd into it. And so now we have like a clean directory with nothing in it, right? So the way this works is that you have to go into your AWS account, and on the CloudFormation section here, if you go to the left-hand pane, you'll see something called IAC generator. And if you click on this, by the way, this is a brand new feature. It just came out like 3 weeks ago or something. How this feature works is that it scans all the resources that exist in your AWS account. And you do this like once in a while whenever you want to use this feature. So I ran this like, 2 weeks ago or something, and it detected 1,949 resources. And then what you do is you can create a template out of resources that exist in your AWS account, a CloudFormation template. And then with that, what you can do is, okay, let's just actually show you since we're already here, demo template. With that, you can bring it into your editor and you can create a CDK project out of that CloudFormation file. And then you can commit it to source control or start deploying it using CDK. It basically lets you migrate from manually created stuff into a CDK project, which is awesome. This was like a really hard problem to deal with for most people. But now they made this like a million times easier. Anyways, let's do this really quick just to show you how it works. So we're going to do demo template. So you can see here, it's detecting a bunch of stuff that are in my account. So this stuff already exists. So I have like an API. I don't know what any of this is. So we're just going to click a bunch of checkboxes here. We're going to go to next, and then we're going to go to next again. I'm just flying through this, by the way, because I don't want to waste your time. Go to create template. And so this kind of takes a minute or two to create the corresponding CloudFormation template for you out of these resources. And then we're going to download it and then run a very specific command. And so, okay, so here's the file that got generated for us. So it's like a CDK code, as you can tell. We're going to download this sucker. So it's called the demo template in my downloads directory. So let's try to get this working now. So the command that we need to run here is CDK migrate --stack -name. You can see I have some nice autocomplete here. So I'm just going to actually just type right here. But just to walk you through what I have. So we have the stack name. We're going to call it CDK local test. We're going to say the language that we want. Actually, it's missing something. So let's say actually like Python or something, just to show you a little bit of a difference in terms of what it looks like. We're going to say from path and then give it a name to a template file that actually this was an older one. So this wasn't the one that we just generated, but it doesn't really matter. So let's try this out. So it's doing some things in Python, and then now we have a CDK local test, so we can change into this really quick to take a look at what's inside here. And actually, if we do this in our editor here, actually I need to go up a directory, so we need to Command O. Let's go back. Here's the other one, and just take a look at what's inside here. So this is the Python generated code for this. So you can see like inside of our stack, what some of this stuff looks like. So it's created an API gateway. Actually, this was the template I created in my test run. So it's pretty much the same thing. It's got some API gateway resources in it. So you can see actually something that's interesting about this is that it uses the L1 constructs here. This is the way the feature works, which I thought was pretty fascinating. So it doesn't use L2. So if you want to migrate to that, you're going to have to do some custom work. Anyways, let's kind of wrap this up now. I want to just delete these stacks to clean up our work. So let's just clear here. This one, the local test one, hasn't been deployed to AWS, so there's nothing really to clean up. So what we're going to do is, okay, we're in this new directory now. We want to go back to our My CDK demo app, and we're just going to type in CDK destroy. And this is going to tear down our application. It's going to remove all the files. It's going to delete our stack from the AWS account. I'm going to press Y to confirm I want to delete it. And you'll be pretty much left with an empty slate here, except for resources that you had that update or deletion policy set to retain. It will keep those resources. And as you can see here, it's just running through the deletion. So it's getting rid of all the stuff that we have in our stack. And so this was a crash course on AWS CDK. I hope this taught you the fundamentals. It makes you a little bit more confident in using CDK and setting it up and getting started. Again, thanks to Warp, the sponsor of this video. And if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe and share it with your friends. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.